Well, for the next two lectures, we're going to be looking at Plato and his philosophy. For this lecture, we'll be looking just really briefly at Plato's life, just to give you some background on where he came from. And then we'll dig into his idea of the forms. It's one of Plato's big ideas. And we'll talk a little bit about how his idea of the forms relates to his epistemology. So we'll be doing that in this lecture, and then in the next lecture, we'll be talking about his ethical thoughts and his political theory. But to begin, Plato is born in Athens around 427 BCE. He is a student of Socrates, and if you remember in the last lecture, Socrates is executed. He's actually executed in Athens in 399 BCE, and he's executed under a democratic government. Now, this execution, as you can imagine, has a huge impact on Plato's life. Shortly after Socrates is executed, he begins to travel, obviously wanting to reflect on the situation, but he's also traveling to meet different people, learn about different ideas, learn about different cultures. He's really getting a wide range of philosophical ideas at this point during his travels. It's specifically noteworthy that he encounters a group of philosophers that we've already talked about, known as the Pythagoreans. So they're still around at this point. And the Pythagoreans very much have an influence on the way he thinks about specifically his idea of the forms, which we're going to be talking about here in a moment. But after his travels, Plato eventually comes back to Athens. He establishes his academy, and that has had a dramatic impact on the history of Western philosophy. Some people call the academy the first university, and I think it's fair to call it that. I mean, obviously it's not, it didn't have everything that our modern universities have today, but there was research being done there, there was education that happened at the academy, and so you could certainly consider this one of the first universities that existed in the Western world, and the impact on Plato's academy can't be understated. So after Plato, he has a famous student, and it's often been said that there's never been a better student than the student of Aristotle, which we'll talk about in our next series when we get to Aristotle. But Plato has a famous student named Aristotle, and Aristotle, you couldn't have asked for a better teacher than Plato, and between these two thinkers gives us a huge formation that gives us the seeds for Western thinking. Well, Plato dies in 347 BCE, and his legacy has been quite significant. Now, we know a lot about Plato because we have a lot of his writings. As we mentioned last time with Socrates, we don't have any writings of Socrates. And then if we look at the philosophers that come before Socrates, we barely have any writings from any of them. But Plato, things start to change because we have 36 writings that are attributed to Plato at least. 6 of those are likely forgeries written by some of his students. But this is significant. So we have a good idea of what Plato thought, what he taught. Now it's noteworthy to point out that we don't have any lectures by Plato. And the reason why that's significant is because the way that education worked in Plato's day is that the writings of Plato would usually be intended for more of a popular audience. So if you were able to read and understand his popular writings, you're getting the basics of Plato. The lectures, on the other hand, is where they would really dig in deep to some of their ideas. And unfortunately, we don't have any of the lectures of Plato, but that's where you would get deeper into his thought. But with the writings that we do have, we see that he writes a lot on metaphysics. He writes a lot on epistemology, on ethics, and so he really is giving the full view of what Greek philosophy was intended, I think, all the way back to the pre-Socratic philosophers. We have all of his writings, or a lot of his writings, on these different areas of philosophy. Now, when you think about his academy and when you think about the purpose of his writings, Plato's goal is really to produce statesmen. That's the reason why the academy exists. He doesn't want to produce demagogues. So if you want to know what's the difference between a statesman and a demagogue, well, a statesman for Plato is somebody who's able to think about what it means to run a society in just ways, using principles of justice. And a statesman is able to reflect on justice, reflect on ideas of goodness, and really do that expert work that's needed, that philosophically expert work that's needed to understand the nature of justice, and then be able to run a society, govern a society according to just principles. Whereas a demagogue would be somebody who's just trying to figure out what does everyone want, and then just governing according to what's popular, but not necessarily according to what's just. And Plato wants to produce statesmen, not demagogues, which we'll talk about more in our next lecture. We are told from Aristotle that oftentimes when people would come to hear Plato give a lecture, so we don't have any of his lectures, as I mentioned, but if people would show up to hear one of his lectures on, say, the good, they were often astonished to hear that he would spend his whole time talking about nothing but arithmetic and astronomy, or of the limit and of the one, and they would be confused because they came to hear a lecture on the nature of goodness, and it seemed as if he spent all of his time talking about all these other things. And so there are these questions that arise when we think about Plato's thought. Why would that be the case? Why on a lecture on morality would he spend so much time talking about math and astronomy? Well, once you understand Plato's thought, it becomes clear. Plato sees that there's a relationship between all of these ideas. So if you want to know what goodness is, you need to get into epistemology. How do we know the things that we say that we know? But eventually you're going to be getting into metaphysics, and when you're talking about metaphysics, you're going to be talking about math and astronomy and all of these other things. And so all of it is related for Plato, which we'll see here in a moment as we look at his idea of the forms. There's this famous painting by Raphael, the School of Athens, that was produced during the Italian Renaissance. In the middle of this picture, you see Plato and Aristotle representing two schools of thought. So you notice Plato on your screen is the one who is pointing upwards, and you notice that Aristotle has his hand hovering over the ground. And this really represents the two big traditions in Western philosophy. Plato, we might consider to be the first rationalist. It's maybe not a completely developed form of rationalism, but I think he would represent the first rationalist, where we might say that Aristotle represents more of an empirical approach to knowledge. And for both of them, for Plato, if you want to know what is right or true or good or just, you need to think and reflect on the idea of those things, the concepts of those things. Where for Aristotle, if you want to know any truth, you need to go out into the world and look. So they have two different approaches. Even though Aristotle is a student of Plato, he doesn't follow all of Plato's ideas. And so because of this, these two twin traditions, Alfred North Whitehead has famously said that the history of philosophy, and he's thinking specifically Western philosophy, is a series of footnotes to Plato. And I don't think that is really that much of an overstatement, especially when you consider Aristotle's writings in many ways are continuing to develop Plato's thoughts, even in the places where he is directly critiquing Plato. You see the influence that Plato has on Aristotle, even in his critiques. And so Plato's idea then, that everyone that comes after him has to think about, is the nature of reality. So Plato argues that reality consists of two parts. So the main part of reality that Plato articulates is what he calls the realm of the forms. And this is a realm of perfection, It's a conceptual world where you can access through deep thinking and deep reflection, and that's the basis of reality. That's the unchanging part of reality. And then he also has what's called the particulars, and the particulars are individual events, objects, or acts that we see in the world, and those acts have their reality because they participate in the forms. And so this is how Plato divides his understanding of reality. This is a dualistic way of thinking about the world. There's the world that we see around us, and those are the particulars, and then there are concepts of those ideas. So what does Plato mean by this? Well, again, I said that Plato was very much influenced by the Pythagoreans, and the Pythagoreans, if you remember, they were the ones that argued that everything can be reduced to mathematics, so all of the reality that we see around us is reduced to numbers. We think in terms of mathematics, and our mathematical thoughts can correspond to a world that is orderly and governed according to mathematical principles. Now, if you think about how that might relate to a theory of knowledge, so again, a theory of knowledge is the branch of philosophy that's called epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. If you think about how the Pythagorean idea relates to epistemology, one of the basic ideas in epistemology is you can say that you know something if your perceptions of the world map on to reality. Well, if you remember, the Pythagoreans were critiquing the materialist idea that everything reduces to one material substance. So now if we think about how that idea might play out today, materialism, we could think of just the fact that we live in a material physical cosmos, mass, time, space, energy, that's the cosmos. And if we think about what it means to be a human being, a thinking being, well, all of our thoughts, according to a materialistic worldview, would say that all of our thoughts, hopes, dreams, perceptions, everything are ultimately reduced to brain states, which are reduced to synaptic firings in the brain, and that is governed by deep laws of physics. We might even get down to the quantum level, but everything in the universe is governed according to material physical processes, and so our perceptions are material, and reality itself is material. Well, the Pythagoreans critiqued this idea, maybe because they didn't think that that account of reality could make sense out of the order of the universe. So when they argue that reality reduces to numbers and not matter, they're rejecting the materialistic outlook, and they're saying that reality is fundamentally orderly, and our perceptions participate, you might say, participate in the order of the cosmos. And so when we think in orderly ways, when we think in mathematical ways, we can understand how our perceptions would map onto the way that the world actually is. Well, I think what Plato is doing is he's taking this idea of numbers and he's just making the idea a little more broad. And so math is very specific. And I think what Plato is doing is saying that there's a more general idea that the Pythagoreans are trying to get at, and that might be, we could just call it the idea of concept. So Pythagoreans think that immaterial numbers are the basis of reality. Plato thinks that concept, or what he calls the realm of the forms, is the basic part of reality. Now, he also argues that the particulars are there, and so he's really trying to bring together two ideas, the realm of the forms and trying to figure out how the particulars, the physical world that we see around us, relate to the forms. But if you think of concept, just the general notion of concept being basic, then you could think of numbers being a subset of concept. So the number 2 is a concept that really exists for Plato, and it exists in the realm of forms. The idea of plus and the idea of the equal sign, these are all concepts for Plato that can be made sense of through his realm of the forms. But if you think of other ideas like beauty, beauty is also a concept, and I think what Plato would argue is that, well, the Pythagoreans were on the right track. If you reduce everything to mathematics, then how do you make sense out of beauty? Beauty seems to not fall under the category of math, but it does fall under the category of concept, and math also falls under the category of concept. And so you might see Plato as broadening the view of the Pythagoreans. If we think of another concept, the concept of goodness, so Plato will say that we all have these intuitions of what is right and wrong, what is good and evil, and our perceptions of what's good corresponds to something that's actually real outside of our perception, and it's not something that's physical, it's a concept that you might just call pure goodness. And so when we recognize a good act in the particular world that we're seeing, the reason why we can recognize that something is good is because our thought corresponds to the realm of the forms where the idea of goodness exists. Now, to illustrate this idea, this notion of the forms, Plato has this famous allegory referred to as the Allegory of the Cave. And if you've been in an English 101 class, you probably have heard this story before. But the way that Plato tells the story is that you should imagine a scenario where prisoners from birth have been chained to a wall inside a cave. And so you can see them on your screen. These prisoners have been chained to this wall from birth, and the only thing that they've ever seen since birth have been shadows on the wall. And so in the picture on your screen, you notice that there are horses, jars, circles, birds, etc. And there are these different shadows that they are seeing. Now, as the shadows move, the images change. But they're still recognizing that what they're seeing on the wall, so if they look at the shadow of a horse, even if that shadow changes, becomes smaller, becomes bigger, they still recognize it as a horse. Well, as Plato is telling the story, he imagines a scenario where one of the prisoners breaks free from the chains and can walk behind the wall that they've been chained to their whole life. And this prisoner can recognize that there are these objects that are casting the shadows that they've been looking at forever. And behind the objects, there's a fire that's casting the shadow. And when you have that first realization, you realize that the things you've been perceiving your whole life aren't the things in themselves. So the shadow of the horse that you see is represented in this story, in this allegory, as somebody actually holding up a horse, and that's what's been casting the shadow. And so you see the substance of what the horse actually is. You're getting more knowledge of what the horse actually is. And then, as the story goes, eventually those who break outside of the cave, they keep going further. And they eventually leave the cave and they realize that there's this whole world out there. They see sunshine for the first time. And initially, this is a traumatic experience. It's a blinding experience because if you've been conditioned your whole life to just look at shadows on the wall, the moment that you see sunshine, you won't be able to see anything until your eyes start to adjust and then you see the real world as it is. And this is his allegory of the cave. Well, what does this story refer to? Well, this allegory of the cave is really an illustration of what he means by his theory of the forms. So the shadows on the wall that the prisoners are looking at their whole life corresponds to the physical world that we perceive around us. So if we go walking down a dirt road and there are trees everywhere, we'll see particular trees and we'll take it for granted that we're looking at the substance of the tree. But what Plato is saying is all the particular trees that you see around you are not the substance of what a tree is. The particular trees that you see are just the shadows on the wall. And to get knowledge of what a tree really is, you have to transcend your sense perception and you need to access the idea of a tree. And the way that you access this is by reflection. It's not something that comes through sense perception. It comes through rational thought. And this is how you access the realm of the forms, where treeness actually exists. And so that's what Plato is getting at with his allegory of the cave. We use our senses to learn things about the particular world, the physical world all around us, but that's not the highest form of knowledge. The highest form of knowledge is when we use our rational thinking to access the essence of things. And this is why I would say that Plato is a rationalist, or the first rationalist, because what a rationalist is somebody who thinks that if you want to know something, you have to think deeply about it for a while. Whereas an empiricist would be somebody that would say, if you want to know something, you have to go out and see. Well, Plato says if you really want knowledge, you have to sit and think and reflect, and that's how you have access to the forms. So if we think about this, and we think about, so why would Plato argue this? What leads him to this conclusion? Well, we can think back to some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, specifically Heraclitus. Remember, he was the one who said that the world is always changing. So if you think about a tree, and you think about how a tree grows, every day the tree is changing slightly. That's just the way the world is. Things are always changing. Again, he said you can't step into the same river twice because it's always flowing, it's always changing. And so if we want to gain knowledge about trees, well, how do we do that? Well, you might say we do it through our senses. So if we think about what we're sensing when we're sensing a tree, we might sense, as you see in the screen, the tree at a particular stage of development. And we say, I'm sensing a tree. That's a tree. But that's kind of a strange thought. I mean, it's an intuition that we take for granted, but why would we think that when I'm sensing a tree at a certain stage of development, that I'm sensing a tree? Because later on, I'll be sensing something different, but I'll still be saying I'm sensing a tree. How do I know that I'm sensing a tree? And if the world's always changing, when does something become a tree versus not being a tree? Or if you have an acorn that is growing up to become an oak tree, at what stage does the transfer happen where it's no longer an acorn, but now it's a tree? If we're relying on our senses, Plato says we don't know how to answer that question, because the world, the world for him is the particulars. That's always changing. So he agrees with Heraclitus that the world is always changing. But he also agrees with Parmenides that if we're to know anything, that things need to always be the same. And so I think what Plato is trying to do here is synthesize what Heraclitus is arguing with what Parmenides is arguing by having a dualistic way of looking at the world. And so when it comes to the idea of a tree, Plato says we can think about what an ideal tree is, and that's where we have knowledge. I know what a tree is. And that concept that I have in my mind, that never changes. And that is consistent with Parmenides, who says everything is one unchanging thing. And so what he's doing is he's bringing together the idea that everything's always changing, and he says, yes, in the realm of the particulars, things are always changing. And he's arguing, but when it comes to the conceptual world, things are always the same. And the way that I can tell that a particular tree is a tree is because the idea of treeness never changes. So he's reconciling Heraclitus with Parmenides. Now, if the idea of a tree is a hard way to think about what Plato is getting at, it might be helpful to think about the idea of a circle. So if I give you the options that I give you on the screen, circle A, B, or C, and I ask you which one is a circle, or if I were to ask which one is closest to a circle, you would probably say C. But then if you ask, what standard did you use to determine that C was correct? What Plato would say is that you determine that C was the correct answer because you have the idea of a tree in your mind. And it's not just in your mind, but your mind can actually access the idea of circleness. And so the standard that you use is the standard of the form of a circle. And when you think about that standard, there is only one perfect circle. There aren't many different circles. And so from these different examples, we get an understanding of what a form is. So a form is an eternal, unchangeable, and universal essence. And furthermore, the forms would exist even if every person were to die, which is to state that it doesn't just exist in the individual perceptions of each person, but the idea of circleness exists even if there were no people to conceive of a circle. It's just something that is there, out there in the real world. Now, Plato's idea of the forms can be articulated in his understanding of knowledge. So if you think about how this metaphysical reality, this dualistic reality, relates to epistemology, again, we go back to the cave illustration, and we're looking at shadows on the wall when we're prisoners in the cave. And he says what we're looking at when we're looking at the individual shadows is we're looking at the particulars. And when we're looking at the particulars, at that point, Plato says you don't have any knowledge of anything just through empirical observation. All you have are sense perceptions, and he just calls that opinion, because you don't really know what it is that you're observing. You don't know the essence of the thing. You're just having images coming into your mind. Now, you get a little higher in understanding, a little higher in opinion, when you start to study the shadows and you notice how the shadows are changing on the wall. And so you're getting from beyond your just sense perception, and you're saying my senses are corresponding to something, but you just think they're corresponding just to the wall, just to the shadows on the wall. And that's a higher level of opinion, but you still haven't reached knowledge yet. To get to knowledge is when you're unchained from the wall, and you walk behind the wall, and you notice the fire and the statues inside the cave. That's when you have the first level of knowledge. And again, you access this through reason. So you have to be unchained from your sense perceptions and think deeply about the things that you're observing. And you notice these are the objects that are casting the shadows on the wall. And for Plato, you access that in the realm of the forms. So the forms is the real substance, and the particulars are just the shadows that we observe around us. And then you still get to a higher level of knowledge once you get outside of the cave, and this is where you access the forms in themselves. So if we think about this in terms of epistemology, at the lowest level, all you're doing is seeing the images. Once you think that those images correspond to the shadows on the wall, you have belief. Then you have lower knowledge once you get to the first stage of knowledge. And then the highest level of knowledge is the dialectic, where you see how the forms relate to each other. And so, again, to look at the examples of a tree, because I think it helps to see examples of this. So when you look at particular trees, you have images of trees inside of your perception, and then you believe that those correspond to particular trees out there in the real world. But once you start to have understanding is when you recognize what the form of the tree is, and that's what helps you recognize particular trees. And then the highest form of knowledge is when you see the forms in themselves and how the forms relate to each other. Or to give another example, in the realm of ethics, we could think of the civil rights movement and this image that you see on your screen of Martin Luther King Jr. giving a speech during the civil rights movement. And you ask, okay, what am I observing here? Now you could even put yourself in the actual situation, and you see protests happening during the civil rights movement, and you ask, okay, what is happening? Well, Plato's theory of the forms helps us understand what's happening. So, at the most basic level, you're seeing images and sounds of people during protests during the civil rights movement. and you'll be hearing speeches. If you want to get a little bit higher in your understanding of what's happening, you might just notice that people are organizing for a cause. But that doesn't give you any insight into what's going on. Once you get to the point where you realize that the cause that these people are organizing for corresponds to justice, then what you're doing is you're accessing the forms. So the particular events that are happening around me, once you say these events are good and just events, well, now you're accessing the forms. Because you don't see that. Justice is not a physical object that you can hold up and you can look at and you can see, yes, this is justice. Justice is the arrangement, again, speaking as Plato, the arrangement of the events in a way that we recognize them as being just. And then, if you want to have the highest form of knowledge, you understand the essence of what justice actually is. And this is where you start asking questions like, what is justice? If it's not a physical thing that I can see, but we still think that justice is a real thing, what is the essence of it? So when I say that the civil rights movement was a just thing that happened, what is it that the word justice and my feelings of justice, what are those feelings corresponding to? And Plato says they're corresponding to a concept, an ideal concept that really exists outside of our perceptions called justice. And this is Plato's idea of the forms, and this is how his idea of knowledge relates to his idea of the forms. For our next lecture, we will see how this big idea that Plato has relates to his idea of ethics, and how this relates to his idea of the person, his psychology, and how this eventually relates to his idea of political philosophy.